Welcome to Made to Be Whole and Happy New Year. Stay tuned as we kick the year off by reviewing the pillars of healing.
Made to Be Whole is intended for informational purposes only. It's not intended to replace the advice or care of a licensed healthcare professional. Participating in this podcast does not constitute a provider-patient relationship with Krista Michener, AHP Integrative Health, or any of the guests featured on Made to Be Whole. Krista Michener, AHP Integrative Health, and any featured guests aren't responsible for any losses, damages, or liabilities that may arise from use of information obtained in this podcast or associated materials. Please consult a healthcare professional for any health-related concerns that you are experiencing.
This is Krista. Welcome back. Those of you that have been listening for a while, we talked a little in one of our earliest episodes about the pillars of healing that I like to focus on and use as a framework for treatment. And so I wanted to review the pillars because I think that they're critical. I have some new insights about them, and I want to apply them specifically to autoimmune encephalitis, which is that PANDAS that we've talked about with Emma and discussed in previous episodes. This is of particular interest to me recently because in the last few months, 3 members of my family have tested positive for that autoimmune brain panel, formerly known as the Cunningham panel, which means that in addition to the infections have induced this autoimmune encephalitis, which has been part of what was stalling healing. So I've tried to take a look back and say, okay, of the things we've been doing, which things have been successful and why? How do I look at this in the framework of everything else that we know and are doing? The reason I bring that up, some people kind of jump from thing to thing. So, for example, you could have someone who says, oh, I've now got this new positive test. I know that what I really have is autoimmune encephalitis or PANS related to Bartonella. So I'm going to stop everything else that I'm doing because that's the real problem. And all I need is IVIG or some other immunomodulatory treatment and I'll be fine. And guess what? They won't be. The same people will have a problem if they ditch everything they're doing with nutrition and hormones and other things because they say, oh, it turns out I have Lyme disease. That was my whole problem. If I just treat the Lyme, I know I'll be fine. I've had so many dear patients say to me, I just know if I can get some antibiotics and treat this infection, I'll be okay. I just know it. And probably not. That's part of the solution, but it's one part. So I have my big eyes and my little eyes for my pillars of healing. My big eyes are infection, inflammation, immune function, and integrity. And underneath each big eye, I have little eyes: identification, investigation, introspection, implementation, and then innovation and investment. So we're going to go over each of the pillars and then review some of those little eyes underneath. So in terms of autoimmune encephalitis or PANDAS, if we're using that as our framework, and I'm probably going to insert a lot of personal narrative here from my own case and my kids because I have the most familiarity with that and permission to share that. So infection. The first step is you have to identify the infection. And you cannot just do a broad identification. You have to stay away from the trap of looking at the world through lime-colored glasses. And what I mean by that is people who have been diagnosed with Lyme disease or are convinced they have Lyme disease and they want to see everything through that lens. You have to, first of all, verify that Lyme disease or another Borrelia infection is at play. And other Borrelia infections include that broad category of tick-borne relapsing fever. You have to distinguish that from other infections that can also come from ticks, fleas, these vector-borne infections broadly. So Babesia. Why does that matter? Lyme and Babesia share some symptoms, but they don't share a lot of treatment. One is a bacteria, one is an intracellular parasite. Very, very different treatment. So you can have Lyme and treat it till you're blue in the face and spend every last penny you have and not get better if you haven't identified that you also have babesiosis and aren't treating that. Bartonella, Ehrlichia, Anaplasma, Rocky Mountain spotted fever. And then we look even more broadly for infections such as Mycoplasma, Brucella, viruses like the Coxsackie virus, especially the Coxsackie B group viruses, herpes viruses, which includes shingles, lots of different strains of herpes can affect you. Epstein-Barr is actually a herpes virus. And you have to do some investigation because I've said it before, I'll say it again. Guessing is expensive too. You can just know that you have these infections, you can read the list and you can just be convinced, but you need to do investigative work, and that includes proper testing. I strongly believe that a good test, even though it may be a large upfront investment, depending on the test you do, possibly a couple $1,000s, is an investment that will save you money. And it will save you money because you're going to be treating the right things. You can easily piss away that much treating the wrong thing and not getting better. You can spend that coming to see me and having me help you treat the wrong thing when we've missed something important. You can have decreased productivity, decreased ability to work. You can lose that amount of money fast by guessing wrong. So this whole idea of a clinical diagnosis, that is part of what we do. We look at symptoms, absolutely, but we have better tools than we used to. We have better diagnostic tools, and we have to utilize those. And that is partly also to cover ourselves because, as people know, there is a bit of a vendetta against the idea of chronic infection, and we have patients who are being mistreated when they tell other providers they're being treated these. We have providers who are being targeted. So I really like to be able to say to a board or anyone else who's being a pain in the butt to say, well, this is what this was based off. Look at this test. This test is like the immunoblots for Lyme from IGeneX are now FDA approved. IGeneX, T-Lab, those are Medicare approved labs. They have accreditations. We talked about T-Lab has the accreditation from the College of American Pathologists. So I want to have tools that are scientifically rigorous and accurate because I want to be able to protect my patients and I want to be able to protect myself. Now, sometimes you have a negative test, but everything still adds up. And so you're going to go ahead and treat. But you still need to exhaust those other options first. If you have questions about which tests to do, go back. We've got previous episodes on that. That is a whole conversation that could take many hours to go through which tests are beneficial and which tests aren't. The main takeaway is you need quality testing. What's available through your regular hospital lab core quest is insufficient. It will sometimes catch it, but it does not test broadly for as many strains of these infections. It is less sensitive, and you can definitely have false negatives. It is more rare with those tests to have a false positive, something that says it's positive and it's not, but you can very easily have a false negative, a test that says it's negative, but it's not. So I strongly recommend that you dig in and you get the right testing. And you can investigate your treatment options and your testing options. And I really recommend finding someone that you trust to help guide you through these decisions because you shouldn't have to carry the burden of knowing it all. That's not sustainable. It's exhausting. And there's a really tricky balance here. I was talking to one of my staff the other day because I have very mixed feelings about the way that my patients utilize the internet. I know that a lot of you have had to be your own healthcare provider, and you're the ones who figured out what was wrong with you because you went to lots of other people who didn't help you, who told you were just anxious, or it was in your head, there was nothing wrong with you, or this was something chronic and not treatable. And if you wouldn't have been curious and determined, you would have never found those answers. But then sometimes some of y'all have a problem letting go of the reins and continue to research ad nauseum. You think ChatGPT is a better healthcare provider than me or someone else. If you feel that way, then you should keep looking till you find someone that you trust more than ChatGPT. You need to have someone that you trust that you can help take the burden off of yourself to make some of these decisions. And you have to know that even though there may be these big technological advances that can summarize data and point you to things, you still don't have the clinical experience of how that plays out in life for people. We had someone recently who sent us pages and pages of what they were sure they had and exactly what they wanted to be treated with and wanted to know if we were going to prescribe these exact medications. It was intense. It was a lot. And we ultimately decided that our office probably isn't the best fit for this individual. But part of that is you can't just come and make treatment demands. Yes, we're all partners in care. It's your body. But if you are not going to trust the clinical judgment and experience of the person taking care of you, don't waste your time and money. Don't waste their time. You're not really in a position to progress. You have to be introspective. That's one of our little I's. So when I say that, you have to have realistic expectations of yourself and of your provider and of the treatment process. You have to ask, am I asking myself reasonable things? Am I asking reasonable things of my provider? There are not quick fixes to any of all of this. You have to ask yourself sometimes, am I being a jerk? And if you are, don't be a jerk. That's not going to get you better faster. It's not going to build bridges. It's not going to help your body heal. As you are introspecting in each of these steps, you need to assess your resources and your barriers to care. Most people do not have unlimited financial resources. I absolutely, completely understand that. So when I make recommendations, I'm just saying, I think this is best practice. I think these are the things that are going to get you better, faster. And in my experience, the people who have these answers waste less time and money and get better faster. And sometimes as you're looking at implementing the treatment, one of the other little I's, you have to be innovative and you have to also be willing to make an investment. And when you're talking about these chronic entrenched infections, you're talking about an investment of time, an investment of money, an emotional investment. It's a big, big deal to get all the way there. And there are a lot of unknowns. There are some people who progress pretty quickly and it's fairly uncomplicated. But unfortunately, most of the time, by the time someone gets to us, they've been sick for quite a while and it's going to take a while. So you've got to be in there for the long haul. And when when I say invested and you say, oh, I don't have the money, that's when I'm talking about this whole innovation and introspection. Well, what resources do you have? Is there something that you can give up that would maybe be able to be used to help your care? Are you willing to put in the time to follow through, to keep your appointments, to do other things to take care of your life? Could you do something like care credit? I've mentioned care credit before. I want to talk a little bit about it. It's a healthcare financing credit card that for major purchases, like over a certain amount, there's no interest for, I believe it's up to 6 months. Some of them might be longer. We do accept it at our office. Just a little side note why we do that and why we don't do payment plans for people generally. It really is ultimately about savings, because by our office taking payment at the time of service, then I don't have to pay a person to do billing, to do collections, to do all those things that actually drive up prices for our patients. And so it's just a much more simple way to do it, especially when I know that there is a resource like Care Credit out there that's actually built for this very purpose and has the ability to, they're a financial institution. I'm not a financial institution. I'm a nurse practitioner. So you have to, in that plan, support your gut, treat biofilms, use multiple treatment modalities. And I think that repeat testing should be part of your treatment plan. You can just treat to symptom resolution until you feel a certain amount better. But if you're going to bother testing and treating, for me personally, repeat testing to make sure that we've adequately tested is really important, because otherwise you run a higher risk of ending up right back where you started in a period of time. So our next big eye of our pillars of healing is inflammation. So when you go to identification of inflammation, you really don't need a lab to tell you that you're inflamed. So labs are not always necessary. They can provide a baseline for comparison. So some people will have a really elevated C-reactive protein or high sensitivity C-reactive protein or sedimentation rate. Those are kind of your basic inflammatory markers. And so that's useful for me to have because I can measure that again as I'm treating inflammation and see it come back into normal range. But what you don't want to do is say, oh, my CRP is normal. I don't understand. I know I'm inflamed, or I thought I was inflamed. That is one marker of inflammation. It's a general marker. It's really, really hard to measure neurological inflammation. That's tricky. So even though there are, again, some markers, interleukins, and different things we can reference, with inflammation, I don't think those markers are always the most important or necessarily going to help your treatment. The lab that will help your treatment as far as inflammation, if you're not having success, is the genomic testing we talked about. So if you go back to the episodes where we've talked about Intellix DNA, and there's one where we interviewed Carol, who's one of the co-founders of it, one of the things that the Intellix panels evaluate are inflammatory pathways and how those are impacted by genes. And why that's super, super important is because depending on what's driving it genetically, there are going to be different interventions that are going to be more or less effective for you. So to me, that's a really, really great test to help us figure out, okay, this person's got runaway inflammation. We're doing standard treatments and nothing's working, or it's not working the way it should. Let's look at those genes and help us figure out what would be better tools. Because again, guessing's expensive too. You can spend $1,500+ on supplements and visits trying to get inflammation under control pretty quickly and guess not right or not adequately, or you can do the genomic testing and find out, this is this, for example, CXC chemoligand. I've got 2 copies of that genetic variant. One of the best interventions for that is actually exercise and avoiding prolonged sitting. And so I've noticed for me with my brain inflammation, especially, but also my legs, I am much better served by getting up frequently during the day and walking around. I would say I was going to exercise an hour a day. I haven't really done that for a while, but we'll pretend I'm going to. I would be much better served by walking 15 minutes 4 times a day than walking for an hour. Same thing. I typically walk for about a half hour a day. In the nice months when I can be outside, I do more because the treadmill's just not as fun. But I do much better when I get up, I exercise in the morning, I walk over lunch, I try to take breaks and move around. And that's a really, really great anti-inflammatory intervention. Now, of course, you don't need a test to convince you, hopefully, to start exercising. But there are other people who I'll look at those inflammatory pathways and think, you know what? Pro-resolving mediators, which are this kind of super special omega formulation that are anti-inflammatory, they're actually a really, really good choice for this person's genes. But pro-resolving mediators are kind of expensive. So it's not something I'm usually going to jump to recommend to everyone unless I can say, you know what, genetically, this is a good fit. Let's try it and let's push these doses higher. One of the best things you can do to test whether inflammation is driving your symptoms, and I put my test in air quotes for those of you who are listening, is how do you respond to anti-inflammatory therapies? That is a really, really good diagnostic tool. So I have discussed before my reaction to IV Procaine. IV Procaine has helped me tremendously. I do it weekly. I can literally feel my brain kind of shrinking, I guess you could say. I can feel the inflammation going down. When I first started it, even though we start at low doses, I was kind of woozy, could hardly keep my eyes open, my head up, because the inflammation was higher at that point. So I felt those changes in pressure more. And then I've noticed if I wait too long between sessions, then things start to get worse. So I don't need a test to tell me that ibuprofen helps my neurological inflammation, because even though I had normal inflammatory markers, my physical response proves the point. There are anti-inflammatory supplements. If you take an anti-inflammatory supplement and your anxiety improves, your headache improves, your gut symptoms improve, whatever, things are better. So particularly, again, we're going back to autoimmune encephalitis. So my son Gideon, who you've met on the podcast before, and this is with his permission, I talk about his case. He's one of the ones who came back with a positive autoimmune brain panel. He's got autoimmune encephalitis. We're in the process of trying to get IVIG approved. We're just trying to keep things managed until then. One of the very, very common symptoms of autoimmune encephalitis is sleep disturbance, and sleep disturbance that doesn't respond to treatment. So he and Daniel both, one of the other positives, have this pattern of horrible, horrible sleep. Krista finds a new intervention. They try it. For a while, it works great. They're sleeping amazing. Gideon had been sleeping, he had told me, like a baby that had been hit by a truck. And then all this great stuff that had been working stops working because the inflammation gets revved up again and sleep is just out of control. And it was interesting. The sleep had been bad for a couple of weeks, and he was just begging me, like, what else do I do? And I'm trying to think about it. And it was interesting. I was praying about it, and I just had this immediate thought, it's inflammation, give him ibuprofen at bedtime. And I thought, okay. And so I told Gideon, I said, I really think this is the answer. And it was interesting. He was so grateful. He said, I've been praying so hard because I just cannot live like this. So we started doing ibuprofen at bedtime, and his sleep has been better. And we're probably going to do that until we get IVIG and get this baseline inflammation better controlled. He does do other anti-inflammatory things like low-dose naltrexone, some of my favorite supplements, but there you go. The ibuprofen is helping. Is ibuprofen ideal for long-term use? Not forever use, no, but not sleeping's not ideal either. And right now we are trying to keep things under control to keep him sane. Things that can help missing link wise when you're doing investigation, nutrient testing, prodrome scan. If I am choosing supplements to help inflammation and I see that you have low glutamine levels, that's going to be a really great place to start, is something that's got high levels of glutamine, because glutamine is, among other things, anti-inflammatory. Introspection, look at yourself, look at what in your lifestyle might be contributing to inflammation. We talked about activity levels. Diet certainly can contribute. We really don't want it to as much as it does because it's a lot of work, but it just does. You know, I recently decided to cut out sugar, and darn it, it helps. I like sugar. It's delicious. You know, I still had something on Thanksgiving, but it makes a difference. And anything you can do to incrementally lower that baseline is going to help. As far as implementation, again, you start with what's in your control and you start small. In the context of something where you have massive inflammation that severely affects your quality of life and your ability to function, like autoimmune encephalitis, it might require a lot. So in my case, because I've already tested positive, I've realized the culmination of everything I do has what's kept me functioning. I hope to one day not have to do it all if I can get IVIG and get over this hump, but I do ibuprofen once a week. I do pro-resolving mediators twice a day. I do plasmalogens. I take varying amounts depending on my symptoms of CBD and sargentodoxycollis, which is an herb, and Cytoquel. I do a lot of anti-inflammatory stuff, but it's kept me functioning. And so I'm just going to keep at it. And it is really nice having that positive test and having context and realizing, oh, this is why it's been so hard. This is why it's taking this much. Just keep at it. Because think about it. You've got a couple of different things that can happen with inflammation. You can have inflammation that starts as the result of an injury or an infection. And if the threat is resolved, if the infection's gone or the injury heals, usually the inflammation goes down. Some people have what's called runaway inflammation where, and again, the genetic test can help us find out if this might be the pattern for you. Their body has a very difficult time turning off the inflammatory cascade once it starts. But if the threat is not removed, if you have an infection that's not been treated, you can't just, I keep thinking of a few people I've met who they're just so convinced they aren't going to need antibiotic treatment because they detox and they take anti-inflammatories. Well, those things are all great, but they're not going to be sufficient. You have to treat your infection or else the inflammation is not ever going to fully resolve. Again, innovation and investment. The final ones, those are very personalized, but you just may have to look at innovating with your budget, innovating with your schedule. If you say, oh, I don't have time to exercise, can you get the little bicycle leg things that you can put under your desk? Can you use a vibration plate at your desk? What can you do? Everybody has can'ts. Everyone has limitations, but I can guarantee you something is in your control and you can start there. As far as prescription anti-inflammatories, go back to our episode on LDN or low-dose naltrexone with Brad White, because that's a really good one that is good for neurological inflammation too. Again, too much detail to go into here, but I refer you back to that episode. So with immune function, this is a big one, obviously, when we're talking about autoimmune encephalitis or autoimmune anything. You first have to identify it. So this is one where I do think testing becomes important especially if you're not progressing. So, I mean, you don't need a test to tell someone your immune system's not working well, but it really does help to have good tests to figure out why, like in what way. So we've talked about the autoimmune brain panel, formerly the Cunningham panel, which you can read about at moleculara.com, is diagnostic of autoimmune encephalitis. It's looking for those autoantibodies that your body's created. Basically, to sum it up, you had an infection or toxin or something, some instigating event. So take Bartonella, which we talked about with Emma. With autoimmune encephalitis, instead of her immune system attacking the Bartonella, it attacked her brain. That led to all of these other symptoms. I think it's a great test. It's super, super exciting. It's diagnostic. You will still need some follow-up tests if you're going to try to get insurance approval for certain treatments, but I think it's well worth it. You also want to be looking at immune deficiencies, other indicators of autoimmunity, and identifying what things might be threatening or disrupting immune function. So for deficiencies, some standard labs, those of you that have insurance that actually pays for labs, you can get an immunoglobulin panel run, and you want your immunoglobulins, it spells out GAME, immunoglobulin G-A-M-E, and your IgG subclasses. So you get some surprises there. Gideon, again, had a pretty significant IgA deficiency, which throws it into the category of also having a primary immunodeficiency, which complicates things even further. But we're tackling one piece of this at a time, and you have to kind of zoom in and out. So we talked before about the micro macro view of things. Sometimes you've got to zoom in and say, all right, we're focusing on this one thing, and then you periodically zoom out and say, okay, what are we missing? All right, maybe we need to zoom in and look at this other little thing and zoom out. So it's a little bit exhausting. You've got to pace yourself so you're not getting whiplash, but look at the big picture, but do one thing at a time and add from there. A CD57 count or a natural killer cell count, that can also be an indicator that your immune system is overwhelmed by infection. Another indicator is a negative antibody response to infections. So that's why I like the FISH testing, the fluorescent in situ hybridization, because a positive FISH test is not dependent on an antibody response. I have many patients who will be FISH positive for Bartonella or Babesia, even though we did not get any positive antibodies. That FISH test is diagnostic. The infection is there, but either it's been there so long that antibody levels just dropped, or their body never mounted a good antibody response, which is another reason why go back to our episodes on testing. There's also something called an anti-GAD that you want to get checked if autoimmune encephalitis or PANDAS. Thyroid antibodies, you've got your ANA, your rheumatoid factor. If you have Crohn's, that's an autoimmune disease. That's an indication of immune dysfunction that does not, contrary to popular belief, you don't have an immune disorder that just affects one area of your body. It may affect one area more than others, but a broken immune system is going to have downstream effects. Things that can threaten or disrupt the integrity of your immune system, toxins. So you've got your mycotoxins, which is your mold, and everybody thinks it's all about mold. This is why we have included in our foundations lab a full panel that looks not just at mycotoxins or mold, but also environmental pollutants, because we are finding this more and more. Gideon, as I mentioned, has really high benzene levels, which we've traced to a genetic problem, and we've determined the source is probably the gas stove that we're replacing in the kitchen. So much variation. People who have worked in shops, people who have worked in agriculture, people who do crafts with glues or they paint, all of those things. Are some people exposed to them and fine? Yes, but ongoing low-level exposures can accumulate, and especially if you have genetic vulnerabilities or nutrient deficiencies that impair your ability to detoxify, you're more likely to have immune disruption related to those, and they need addressed. Nutrient deficiencies also are a threat to good immune function. That's why I need all my patients to do good nutrient testing, the end. Because I don't want to just hear, oh, but I take a good multivitamin. I had a patient with severe neurological symptoms who's actually taking really high doses of a few nutrients that help neuropathy, and they do make a difference in this individual's symptoms. But then when we did the labs, the levels are still really low. So this person's demand is far exceeding their intake. And then for this particular individual, I'm like, we've just got to do IVs. I mean, we've got to do that for a period of time to get you back out of deficiency range before we start chasing other things. Genes can definitely affect your immune system. Again, genetic testing helps that. And as you age, your immune system is not as robust. So introspection, you've got to look at the big picture with all of this. You've got to zoom in and out. There may be a million different things, and you say, I can't do all these things at once. And you're right, you can't. So pick one and start. Just pick one, gradually reduce the number of things that are disrupting immune function, and those cumulative effects will yield improvements. You've got to look at what your resources are, as far as finances, emotional resources, your support system, and then implementation, you start and repeat. You know, all of this is a cycle. It can be a really big investment, especially if you need IVIG. That's one of the reasons why I really like the autoimmune brain panel, aka Cunningham panel, because it will help with getting IVIG covered. So the process for getting IVIG covered by insurance, if you think I can just write a letter and convince your insurance company to pay for something that costs $20,000 an infusion, I appreciate your trust, but they don't care about that. They need data. So if somebody gets a positive Cunningham panel, I'm ordering some specific labs like those anti-GAD antibodies. We're looking at other things that affect immune function. They usually want a CT of the head so that we can rule out anything else causing those symptoms. And then we were really blessed to iLads to hook up with IV Solutions, which is a national company that provides home IVIG and helps us with the prior authorization process because it's really difficult. The other thing that's super, super cool about them, if it's something they can't help me with, they're very straightforward. Like I had one patient, they said, we can't help get this covered because he's out of network, but we've applied for in-network coverage and we'll have it by January. If he needs something before then, I would suggest using this company. So they're a great resource for directing us and taking some of that off because, again, it could be a full-time job for one person in our office just trying to do all of these hoops for approval. So we've found some cool people to partner with to help figure out if that's a reality. The other thing they'll do if you can't get insurance to cover IVIG, they do have some copay cards, and they'll also, if somebody has no coverage, provide it at cost plus like 5% or something that's not even really covering their expenses. It's still pricey, but they're trying to make it accessible for as many people as can. And most of the time we can get it approved to do in your home, which is really, really fantastic, especially for someone who has an immune disorder. I don't want you in a hospital with a bunch of germy people if there's a way for you to be comfortable at home and do it. So you're going to have to innovate and be patient. It is an investment, but again, zoom in and out. Some of these things are super, super expensive, but my husband and I keep thinking, well, if we have to work until we die to pay some of this off, if our kids can be functional and grow up to be productive adults and work and have jobs, even if all we cared about was money, which isn't, but even if it was, this would be a financially sound investment because one day they're going to be able to make money and not be dependent because they're not going to be so sick they can barely pull themselves out of bed some mornings. So our last pillar is integrity, which to identify, we first need to define. I define integrity as a wholeness or connectedness of the body, mind, and the spirit. I think you have to address all of those domains. And I would include in that your connection with others, your family, your community, with God. And as far as the investigation of integrity, just step and say, am I neglecting one of these domains? Am I neglecting myself spiritually? Am I neglecting myself mentally? Am I neglecting my physical health because I'm not making time to exercise or go to appointments or do physical therapy or whatever it is that you need? Because I really don't think you're going to get well without that integrity. With introspection, ask yourself, are you being honest with yourself and others? And I think that this really requires ongoing assessment because unfortunately, in the context of chronic inflammation, chronic infection, we have a lot of fluctuating abilities. What you're able to do one week, you might not be able to do the next day or week or hour. And so be patient and kind with yourself and with others and really work on communicating that. Now, finally, my final I, this isn't one of the pillars, but I would call this kind of like the big canopy we're putting over them all, is the individualization of treatment. Everyone has different personalities. Everybody has different preferences. Everyone has different people in their life and levels of support or lack of support. Everybody has different financial resources and different obligations. It's very different. This is one of the reasons I'm so passionate about getting my kids ready now, because they don't have families of their own yet. It's a lot harder to take care of all this if you have other people depending on you. You still have to do it because eventually you're going to crash. But all of that affects how much we can do and in what order. So you need to assess and individualize to your situation. And this is where I would really recommend getting off the freaking internet, because people come in and they're like, oh, I watched this person, this podcast, or this influencer, and they said you can't get better unless you do this, or I don't have the time or the ability to do what they did. Who cares? You're not them. What do you have to give? And start with something, because I promise you have something. I promise you have something you can give and something that's within your control. And then my two kind of big capital letter ones for individualization are the genetic piece of it. We talked about it in context of these other things, but that is one of the best tools for individualizing a treatment plan, is finding out what is the blueprint of your body for healing. It's just super critical. If you genetically cannot absorb vitamin B12 in your gut, then you're not going to get better until we're doing something to bypass your gut and get you the B12. If you genetically can't convert T4 to T3 in your brain, you're never not going to be anxious until we work on getting that replaced. So I think this is an investment that I would encourage everybody to make at some point. Like I said, it's not inexpensive depending on which panel you're talking about, $1,200 to $2,500. There's a big range, but it's not wasted because it never comes back and says, there's nothing you can do. Life's rough. Good luck. It always has a roadmap for your healing. And then the other thing I would throw out to those of you who have more robust spiritual life. I think prayer is very helpful. I use prayer a lot because I get overwhelmed and I pray and I just say, help me see where to start. Help give me peace and perspective to know where to start. I haven't found the prayers that say, just make me better and take all my problems away to be very useful. Just kind of like if you have a kid who comes to you and says, I just want you to make all my problems go away. But if the kid who comes to you and is willing to do their part, you can work with them and God can help you see resources that you didn't realize you have. He gives us so much grace and patience that we don't give ourselves. He can help you innovate in ways that you never would. And he can also just help you prioritize, help you know what you need the most, what your kids need the most, and where to go from there. So I would say this big canopy of individualization is really, really important, but it does need to still include looking at any contributing infections, treating inflammation on an ongoing basis, modulating the immune system, and that integrity, working together with your body, mind, and spirit, with your community and your people so that you can become and stay whole, because you and I and everyone around you was made to be whole.
Have a podcast question or suggestion? Text or call us on the podcast info line at 330-439-0686. Thank you for spending time with me today. If you like what you hear, please subscribe to be notified when new episodes release. And remember, you were made to be whole.